So, between the new war in Iraq, the rebellion in eastern Ukraine, Boko Haram in Nigeria, and Israel invading Palestine again, war has suddenly become the cool thing to talk about and debating again. So much so that we've made up both the semi-final and grand final of the European Debating Championships, and I suspect you'll get at least one war round in every tournament between now and Worlds. So that makes it a fairly important thing to talk about. The first thing I just want to flag before we actually get into the meat of the session is that lots of people get scared away by these topics, usually from either the words in them and not knowing what country that is about, or they just feel like there's this added complexity to a war debate that doesn't exist in other debates. There's a few reasons why you should actually be really calm and collected when it comes to war debates. The first thing is that everyone else feels that way. They feel disadvantaged when they see the topic, they panic, they hesitate, they don't know what they're talking about, which means that it's really easy to do at least average in them, as long as you just keep your cool and actually think about the topic. There are also debates in which a really small amount of knowledge can get you a long way in a better speech. So if you happen to know the names of the actors in the ISIS crisis or their basic motivations, it's a lot easier for you to debate about them than it would be really complex and sophisticated actors. My example is things like social movements in Western nations, because those groups kind of encompass a wide array of actors with different motivations. War is a much more simple and objective thing to debate about. People dying bad, people not dying good, weapons kill people, etc., etc. And once you get over that initial panic, they're actually really fun topics to debate about. So my takeaway from this first point is, don't suddenly feel like they're a whole different type of debate. They're actually very similar to a lot of other motions, and if you just put your mind to it rather than freaking out, they're really easy to get good speakers to listen. And I know that from experience, whereby my speaker score shot up from a 78 average to an 84 for the war round of that tournament. So, things I'm not going to talk about in this session, because there's way more than I can cram into one hour. There's a couple of training videos already available online. The first one is the one that Victor Finkel did back in 2010. It covers peace theory, ways that different countries cannot go to war. And I really don't have anything to contribute to that, plus his voice is way more sexy than mine. So I'd suggest that if you want to learn about that stuff, you just find a nice quiet area, put on some romantic music, and listen to that training session. I'm also not really going to spend any time on drones, because they're a very small area and we have more information on them than we can possibly need. And I'm not going to focus on sort of tangential issues like the use of surveillance or media coverage of the war. This is mostly going to focus on the operation of the military and the use of it to resolve conflicts and crises. And if you don't know what I mean when I say war, the general thematic area, I can't really teach you anything in this training session. So, is everyone clear on the sort of area that we're going to cover? Yeah? Right. So what we are going to talk about is firstly, sort of first principles. I don't think I'm worthy to actually call my training session that. And then we're going to go through the types of debates you commonly see and the best ways to kind of do them. Does anyone have any hesitations before we get into the meat of the training session? No? Cool. Alright. The first thing to do when you see a topic is figure out where the clutch of the debate is going to exist. Once you see the topic, depending on whether you're the alpha or negative, it should be very clear what the objective philosophy and mechanism of at least one side of that debate is. The objective is the thing that you're trying to accomplish at the end of the day. And in almost every debate, it's that we want to minimise the loss of human life. Really, the only exception to that would be if you're some sort of funny rogue actor. For instance, you are being asked to assume the role of Vladimir Putin for the debate, and you're probably willing to accept Eastern Ukrainian civilians dying in order to accomplish a strategic goal. But in general, when we are just we, it usually means either the United States or the UN, and what we care about is making sure that the fewest number of people die. But it's possible that you're some sort of actor that doesn't give that doesn't give equal weight to all lives. So you might be willing to kill terrorists in order to save civilians. You might be an actor like Israel, who probably prioritises its own citizens over and above Palestinians. So figure out what your goal is, but it's almost always going to be for less people to die. The second bit of your sort of team line is what approach are you going to take to achieve that? So if your goal is to save lives by stopping terrorists, that might mean we are going to blow up the terrorists' hideout, or it might mean we are going to negotiate with that country, we're going to develop it economically, and we're going to sort of disrupt the breeding ground for terrorists. And obviously you can't do that at the same time as you're blowing the area up. So the philosophy is sort of the general approach you will take to resolving a crisis. And in most debates, that is where the clash is going to be. One side has a particularly aggressive military approach to taking down the crisis, and the other side wants a more diplomatic or economic solution. Do people understand what I mean by like philosophy in a debate? Yeah? And then the third place is the mechanism. So very few debates actually happen here, but if both teams agree on the objective and they agree on the philosophy, then there can be a debate about what is the most effective way to go about it. Do we invade using this force or this force? Do we use surgical strikes or do we use a full-on ground invasion? Do we use private military contractors or do we use the United States Army? And in that debate, it's essentially just figuring out which one is going to do the job most effectively and which one is more aligned to the philosophy and the objective that you've previously established. So the first thing you want to do in a debate is suss out what all of those things are for whichever side is taking on the burden of the motion. If the motion is that we should assassinate dictators, does anyone want to have a go at telling me what the objective, philosophy and mechanism of that debate would be, for the affirmative? Anyone?
The objective would probably be to free as many people as possible from a dictatorship.
Yeah. Philosophy?
You're willing to sacrifice the dictator's life.
Yeah, and possibly the people he has eaten dinner with him at the time, depending on exactly what it is. And what's your mechanism?
Assassination.
Yeah. If you go more specific, I would probably go drone strike, but yeah. So it's very obvious from that debate what one side has to lay out as their objective, philosophy and mechanism. And almost every motion will make it obvious for one side, right? The other side will also either have their goals set by the motion, or more commonly, they get to pick one. And what that gives them the opportunity to do is decide where the debate is going to happen. They can agree that we need to assassinate the dictator and that we should be trying to free people, but just say we can use a special ops force instead of a drone. That's probably going to be a pretty boring debate, isn't it? Philosophically, they probably want to go with something more like let's arm the rebels or let's, put sanctions on the dictator and try to resolve the crisis economically. And the more interesting debates happen, the higher you try and push the clash of the debate. But never walk into a debate, see what the motion is about, and on the net just try to attack that motion. You need to have your own plan that you're going to clash against that affirmative motion. Does everyone understand one? Is everyone clear on where the clash might be and how to identify it? Yeah, cool. First principle. For those of you who don't recognise that graphic, get out. Or talk to someone during the break and figure out what it is. So the first common clash that we're going to look at is the Paragon versus Renegade approach. The terminology is not important, and you probably shouldn't actually use those words in debates because they have their own rather different definitions. But basically, a renegade actor is very aggressive and utilitarian in determining what is the best course of action. They're perfectly willing to kill one person if it saves two. They are more than happy to intervene militarily. They don't shy away from conflict. Whereas the Paragon prefers a much more diplomatic and cooperative approach to resolving crises. They might still use a military alternative, but as much as possible, they want to minimise the harm at every stage of a conflict. So whereas a renegade would gladly send in a drone strike and kill 10 civilians if it took down a terrorist leader, the Paragon would prefer to try and negotiate with that terrorist leader or the civilians to get him to give himself up, etc., etc. And the biggest difference between those in terms of how they practically arise in debates is usually how much do you trust actors that you don't have direct control over. Because if you don't trust Hamas to negotiate in good faith and you're Israel, then the renegade solution is the only one you can be reasonably sure will work. Whereas if you think you can trust them to spend aid on schools and hospitals rather than weapons, then that makes economic engagement actually a practical solution for you to pursue. So those are like the two broad ends of the spectrum and the biggest difference between them. As with all first principles, there is like a spectrum. You can fall somewhere in the middle. We will invade this country, but first we will threaten them and warn them that we're going to do that. But I would say that going right in the middle of that spectrum is probably the least effective place you can probably be, which is what makes it different from, say, a democracy spectrum, where a government that's mixed parts accountability and effectiveness is probably the one you're aiming for. If you're equal parts Paragon and Renegade, that means you're willing to assassinate a dictator, but only after you've warned them that you're going to assassinate them, after you've evacuated civilians from that area, and after you've used like a special ops force so that you don't inflict unnecessary casualties. Probably going to be a pretty ineffective assassination at that point, isn't it? So in general, I would advise you to take a moderately hard line position from either of those points in debates. Is anyone clear about like what either of those philosophies are at this point? You understand what I mean by a renegade and a paragon? Yeah? Cool. So how do we do these debates better than just identifying those ideas and clashing them against each other? The first thing to say is don't be afraid to be hardline and aggressive with your position. I've seen far too many debaters tragically unwilling to defend the renegade hardline. So they've had to defend torturing prisoners, but they've included, tribunals and warrants to determine whether or not we can abduct that person. There's been a 2-month review process, and by torturing we mean like really gentle torture that can't possibly inflict physical damage. And it's just meant they've had bugger all effectiveness in their torturing to defend, right? And if you can't get information out of that suspect, then there's no point abducting them and torturing them in the first place. So the first thing is, if emotion forces you to be one of those positions at the extreme, don't back away from that, defend it. The second thing to say is that the debates in their best form have plans that originate from those philosophies, and those are what clash against each other. So if you're willing to assassinate terrorists with drone strikes, your justification for that is that even if there are some civilian casualties, those terrorists dying means that they will not be able to kill people in the long term, and the net number of deaths is reduced. So if the other side then wants to attack you on, oh, you're killing civilians, that argument becomes much less effective when you have a long-term plan to relate it back to it, doesn't it? And if you see the EUD semi-finals, which are up right now, in one of the rooms, the motion in both rooms was that we should invade Iraq and forcibly implement a partition plan. And the opening gov in one room spent the first 4.5 minutes talking about the history of Iraq and then establishing the imperative that people were dying. At no point did they defend like how effective their invasion was going to be, and at no point did they sort of preemptively deal with the burden of your invasion is going to kill people. So make sure that you're not just abstractly advocating the motion. Make sure you're actually coming up with a plan that substantiates your harm and creates a lesser amount of collateral damage, and then clash those plans against the one that your opposition presents. The third thing to say is focus on the contentious and important issues. In that debate. So there's the biggest reason that teams, especially in the opening half of war debates, lose is because they spend far too much time on issues that aren't important. So say your argument is say one side is assassinating a dictator, and the opening opposition decides to run assassination is a moral and immoral and illegal tool of warfare. Alright, that's probably true, and a moral philosopher might care, but the opening up presumably has not derived their authority to assassinate someone based on the morality of that action. They've probably done it because they want fewer civilians to die in the dictator's harsh reign. So make sure if you're the opposition that you recognise that and spend a large chunk of the debate on the effectiveness of assassinating that dictator and whether it will actually liberate those people. Don't question something that the act is probably not going to try that hard to defend. I know that whenever I've been asked to defend assassinating dictators, I've literally stood up in the world and said, yeah, we recognise this is probably immoral and illegal. We don't give a crap. We care about saving lives. And any team that tries to attack them on a ground that is not really important to their position is not going to work. So if you're the Paragon, you care about the morality and humanitarian concerns. If you're a renegade, you don't. And so if those are the positions in the debate, the humanitarian concern, the moral moral concerns are not all that important. Do people understand that solution? Yeah. Cool. Second first principle, accountability versus efficiency. And there's just a quote from the West Wing demonstrate what happens when you don't have any accountability in the military. You attack Iran and then blame them for something else later. This one does have much more of a spectrum than the previous one did. In terms of where the military sits right now, it's probably in the bright red. Most of its regulation comes from within its own structure, and the accountability is basically limited to electing government officials. But a lot of debates are about getting a new procedure in or putting a new actor in place and changing how accountable or efficient the military is. To give you a brief idea of how it works right now, you don't need to know all of this diagram in all that much detail. The important bits are basically that the President of the United States has final say in military action and gets to sign off on it. He works in cooperation with the Department of Defense and the Defense Secretary. The Vice President of the US basically does not appear on this diagram. He is informed by the Joint Chiefs of Staff, which is like the heads of the military, the head of the Air Force, the head of the Navy, etc. And he deliberates with the National Security Council, which is mostly the Cabinet Secretary, so it's a very largely civilian body. And essentially, what happens when a crisis comes up is they call a secret meeting in an underground bunker or in the war room, and he gets information from the Joint Chiefs of Staff, he talks with his members of the National Security Council, and they approve one of 2 or 3 possible plans in response to that crisis. In theory, Congress is supposed to have the power to declare war, but in practice, the President can pretty much operate the military without their say-so. So Barack Obama wanted the Congress to sign off on the US response to chemical weapons in Syria, like early this year, late last year, but he probably could have gone ahead and sent the military in without their say-so. The theoretical division of powers is Congress declares war and then the President carries out that war. But thanks to agencies like the CIA, the President can pretty much attack their country at any time if he so chooses. And a lot of debates, especially in recent history, have been about should we give more of that power to Congress or should we give that power directly to the people in like referendum, which we've seen in pro-autonomous. Is anyone sort of unclear on like how Obama makes decisions? Or like any questions about this bit? No? Cool. So how do we do this debate? The first thing to say is that like more or less accountability is a pretty vague thing to be pushing for in a debate. And there's no reason you should really care about it, unless there is some sort of practical outcome that you can relate it back to. So my first tip in an accountability and effectiveness debate is pick an objective that you want to try and accomplish so that your adjudicator has something to sort of compare your case to. Are you actually achieving it, and is that thing good? And there'll basically be 2 kinds of those. One is like a strategic objective. We want it to be more difficult for Obama to send out drone strikes. Or the other is sort of like an operational critique of the military. So servicemen getting sexually abused, or people dying because of oversights in the military procedures. And I just put up a list of possible problems for you to relate it back to there. And most of these have like an accountability solution and an efficiency solution, and the debate can be about which one is better. So, for instance, like negligent deaths being caused by oversights. What would someone, like, let's say the motion is that we should allow people to sue the military for negligence. What do you think the AF is going to say about fixing that problem? Anyone?
The military doesn't do it sufficiently well on their own, so yes, we need a way of getting around that. So,
yeah. So we're going to bring in like an extra layer of regulation to prevent those things happening. What's the negative say?
It's in the way of like military's ability to get things done.
Yeah. So it like impedes their own operations. I think it's probably also a neat argument that goes when people fear the repercussions of being sued for negligence, they're much less willing to come forward with information in the first place. and so like the military has less access to that information in order to resolve those problems. So the first step in an accountability and effectiveness debate is to actually like pick something that you're trying to achieve. Don't just say we want more or less regulation for the sake of it. And this is different from a democracy debate in that a lot of times efficiency is slang for people will die if the military isn't able to operate as unhamstrung as possible. Second tip in these kind of debates is that saying more accountability is probably not as good as being able to say, here is a new feature of accountability that didn't previously exist. So think about the new mechanism you're introducing and what it uniquely contributes that the previous ones didn't. The first, most obvious one is like you might be bringing in a new actor that didn't previously make decisions in the military. So the perspective of the president or the generals is obviously going to be like highly strategic. They have an overall concern of everything that the US is doing at that time being, whereas a lawyer in a negligence suit is obviously very concerned with like legal problems and ethics, and probably only cares about that one case that he's working on. Don't fall into the trap of defending the stupidest possible characterization of that actor. So, if the debate is about a referendum as it was in Paragon, don't assert that the civilian public themselves are totally responsible for the decisions that the military makes about whether or not to enter war. There's a process that determines that, right? The media concocts stories and provides the public with information. That's essentially going to narrow down what they could possibly think of to the relevant material. The President and the Senate are going to come up with viable plans, and the public essentially gets to choose between them, right? So, think when you're bringing in that new perspective, think about like what will go into informing that person before they make a decision. And that's a good way of getting around really stupid arguments. That's also a principle that's applicable to things like economics debates. We will, like, I've heard many times on topics like electing the head of the central bank, the other side say, people are too stupid to know how the economy should be run. Well, in the real world, people are too stupid to understand how a lot of things should be run. That's why the people running for that office give them a plan and then get them to pick what they consider to be the least terrible plan. So actually, you know, think about the detail of how the stakeholder will make a decision. And think about what they can bring to that table that no other actor can. So take for instance a debate about using civilian courts to resolve sexual abuse in the military, right? The military that go into court, the military that make up court martials and handle that right now have very practical concerns running the military. They want that trial to take up as little time as possible. They want the fewest number of servicemen discharged, and that like practical concern probably means that they fudge the trial a little bit, right? Whereas if you were to bring in a civilian court, they would not really have that concern. And their goal is discovering, did the abuse happen, how bad was it, how should the person be punished as a result? And whether or not you think that that is more important is a big part of that debate. Whereas if you were to make that debate really, really badly, one side would say, the military is not resolving this right now, and the other side would say, well, what are judges going to do different? And it would just become like a rhetorical question debate. Yeah, and the final thing you can do is often say, well, you know what, this stakeholder we're bringing in doesn't bring a new perspective at all. But they haven't been fighting the war for 6 years, and they haven't gotten used to seeing the casualties, so they will bring the same perspective, but fresher, and because of that, we'll get like better outcomes. So a doctor who's been working as a field medic in Iraq for 4 years has probably become like pretty used to seeing comrades die, and is perhaps more likely to make an unnecessary oversight in treating patients than someone who just brought in from the news. Anyone got questions about like how to analyse any of these stakeholders? No? Cool. And the last tip on this kind of debate is that the military is not one single entity, and a lot of material in debates can come from discussing the interactions between different stakeholders. So if we were to suddenly allow people to sue the military would not be one entity in response to that. There would be the people right there on the ground that were there to see the accident and were probably responsible for the accident. They then have to convey that information to their superiors. They then have to convey that information to their superiors, and then the public and the courts have to decide what happens based on seeing that. So talk about how each rung of the accountability change will alter when you implement a model. And you'll find that particularly when you're in the closing half, that's a good way of extending really simple analysis that came out of your opening half. So in the negligence debate, the opening might well argue, well, this increases the incentive for the military to act and prevent negligence from occurring. And then closing will say, here is specifically where that problem comes from. It comes from base commanders not being held accountable because it's their superiors that get tried in court-martials later on. So what this will do is create a personal liability for them that they now have to respond to. And that's basically all the advice I have on the accountability and effectiveness. Those are the only real two first principle spectrums I wanted to look at. Does anyone have any questions about them before we move on to actual types of debates? No? I'm going to do it for time. Alright. To sum up the entire world of debating and debate debates, there are only three kinds of real debates. One is a legitimate conflict debate. So this tool of war or this type of activity that can take place, do we think it's a good thing or do we think it's a bad thing? That could either literally just be that the desecration of religious sites is a legitimate act of warfare and you're like the UN advocating whether or not you think you should punish people for it. Or it might be that we should use this as a tool of war, where you're some sort of private actor. But that debate is basically just about, is this thing good or bad for the practice of warfare? And obviously that relates very heavily back to the Paragon and Renegade first principle. The second kind of debate is about changing the operational procedure. So that's the kind of debate we were just talking about then, whereby you're doing something different to the military, and as a result of that, there will be more or less accountability and effectiveness, or they might do something big or something different. Usually that's mostly accountability and effectiveness debate, but they can also bring in elements of the Paragon Renegade clash. So, for instance, this house would discharge victims of sexual abuse even against their will. That can include a Paragon and Renegade clash, which is that, it wasn't this person's fault that they got assaulted. It's certainly not fair that they should be punished for it further, but that person could represent, a psychological instability that would be a threat on the battlefield. And if they suddenly became unable to fight in combat, then that would put theirs and other people's lives in jeopardy. So whether or not you're willing to be that harsh about the operation of your military also plays into that debate. The third kind, which is perhaps the one that people find most difficult, is do this thing. We're going to get the US to invade Iraq and we're going to get them to forcibly partition into 3 separate states. And since that's the most foreign to the material we've just talked about, we'll go into some detail about it in a second. But is anyone unclear about what those 3 kinds of debates are? No? Ask me questions, guys. I have no idea whether you're absorbing it. There are a lot of you confused expressions on your faces. Alright. Yeah. So, argument for intervention. The types of issues that come up in invasion or assassination debates are always the same. And it's the teams that shy away from that formula that end up doing really bad. So, if you go back and look at Victor Finkel's world-winning speech from 2011, it's one of the best speeches ever, but it's actually pretty simple. The ideas he's expressing are really obvious and really intuitive to anyone who sees the motion. And he's not going into ludicrous analysis about the geopolitical situation in Zimbabwe. He establishes a clear crisis, which is that people are getting killed and suffering, and the government is complicit in that. We're going to invade and stop them by doing X, Y, and Z. And at the conclusion of that, we're going to form a stable government that makes Zimbabwe a better country than it was before. And that's pretty much all that you really ever need to prove in order to win a debate. Yet it's astounding how many people sort of stem off into tangential issues that aren't all that important, whether or not this is morally correct according to the principle of sovereignty. Do we really care? The issues that are almost always the focus of the AF case in an invasion or an assassination debate are firstly establishing that there is an imperative to act. And usually it's not too controversial to prove that, right? If the issue in another country is so horrific that we would even consider intervening militarily, most people are probably going to agree that something needs to be done. So my advice in making that argument better is spend like 20 seconds establishing that there's a bad thing that needs to be stopped. And then the rest of that argument needs to be about why another solution is not an option, or why no solution is not an option. So let's take the example of the current conflict in Iraq. ISIS is killing people, robbing them, and exiling them, and is trying to create like a caliphate. That took about 20 seconds. That will take about 20 seconds to explain in a debate, and it's an imperative for some sort of action. It's not an imperative for invasion. So how can we make this imperative stronger? How can we argue that we need to invade specifically? Any thoughts? Yeah.
The Iraqi government is completely ill-equipped to deal with what you just said.
Yeah. So, like, that's a lack of other solutions available. I think that's definitely a good way to go about it. How about a time imperative? Why might it be really important to act very, very soon?
There are people stuck around besides dying.
Yes, but I think that's probably like that was probably in the initial version, which is that there's a conflict happening right now. Yep.
Terrorist groups, the longer you allow them to exist, the more likely they can recruit them.
Yep. So ISIS is going to get stronger the longer we fail to intervene, and that's going to make future solutions more difficult. Yep.
If they take Baghdad and become a state, then there's not much we can do about it. Without going into like.
Well, that's a threat. I think it's probably less plausible. Yeah. Similar argument I'd make is that the conflict is going to escalate, and everyday Sunnis and Shias are going to be dragged into a fight against one another. At that point, the fighting will become so heavily entrenched that not only is a military solution impractical, any kind of solution is impractical, because you literally have to go around to everyday Iraqis and break them up and fight them. So, like, the important thing for novices to take away from this is that it's important to establish an imperative to act. And what I want the more advanced debates to take away is that there are better ways of making that argument than others, and usually that involves forcing the other side to explain why they have an alternative solution and why they work within those parameters. The second thing you can sort of talk about is the effectiveness of your intervention. And I find the teams that only ever kind of do average are the ones who say, here's a problem, here's why nothing else will work, take our word for it that this will. Because that just leaves like a big hole for the other side to exploit open. Actually walk through your solution a little bit and explain, compare it to the alternative as to why there'll be less damage. So again on that Iraq example, it's going to be almost impossible to deny that a US invasion will kill some people. Better to sort of say this will result in like the minimal number of casualties possible from a conflict, and that stopping the war right now means that people who will otherwise get dragged into this conflict don't. And then talk about like how you disassemble the opposition power structures, etc., all fairly relevant to the specific debate in question. But make sure you've actually like given us reason to believe that your solution is not going to work, rather than just presenting it as the only alternative to nothing. Make sense? Yeah. The third bit, and this is where like the average debates become the really good debates, is this debate doesn't end and die after your solution has been implemented. A lot of analysis needs to go into what happens after that, and what's your long-term plan for resolving a conflict after you've intervened militarily. So after you invade Iraq, how are you going to negotiate a successful partition plan? What's going to stop ISIS from attacking southern Iraq after you leave again? This is where mostly the analysis tends to focus on the motivations of the stakeholders and how you're going to appease them enough to stop a conflict in the long term. And depending on what conflict we're talking about in particular, that either means you've removed the rogue actors, so we've killed ISIS and now we're negotiating with the rest of the Sunni population of Iraq, or we're like appeasing the existing stakeholders enough that it won't be worth continuing. We're going to let ISIS rule northern Iraq, but we're going to help them set up a stable oil industry, we're going to get them to create a functioning city, and then we want to risk that by going to war again. And the people who never have a long-term plan are the ones who lose debates to the teams that do. Because if the adjudicator was kind of like iffy on whether your military intervention would be successful, but the other side has successfully explained why that intervention will prevent any sort of long-term peace plan being negotiated, then that side is going to be. Everyone clear on like those three core issues? Yeah? Alright. The fourth place that particularly closing teams can pull an extension from, if everything else has been discussed, is the Tim Mooney approach of discussing what will happen if we don't do this instead. So, in the same World's Grand Final, where opening gov had essentially taken everything about why this solution needs to happen and why this solution will be successful, Sydney and closing gov then ran, here's why their negative solution actually works in the exact opposite way that they think it will. If we allow the existing crisis in Zimbabwe to continue, they've said that the regime will slowly hand over power when it falls apart. And you instead tell the opposite story. You talk about how that regime will just become stronger or how it will prosper under the conditions where the West doesn't intervene. And that's basically all the relevant material that you can ever have when you're arguing in favour of an intervention. Can anyone think of any sort of argument for invading Iraq that doesn't exist within those issues? No? Cool.
What about stuff when you talk about the effects of invading, say, Iraq, but like on other interventions, that sort of thing? So that's where sovereignty starts to become something one might care about?
Well, personally, I've never put full stop in those arguments. My response to them in debates is usually, like, conflicts are distinct and unique enough that they don't immediately assume the solution from one is immediately relevant to another. Like, just because you invade Iraq, I don't think Bashar Assad is suddenly going to be worried that you're going to invade Syria as well, because it's a very different situation. And I usually don't think, like, some people often try to make those arguments in debates, but I usually don't think that they're all that important. And crucially, it's way more than you'd be able to prove in a 7-minute speech. You'd have to prove that because of invading Iraq, Syria suddenly worries that you're going to invade it, and that the situation is somehow going to become worse than it currently is, and that Assad wouldn't be preparing for a Western invasion if you didn't invade Iraq. And I just don't think you can plausibly prove that much in a debate. Probably an issue for Obama to consider, but not an issue for you guys to consider. Any other questions? Cool. Arguing against intervention, that title should be different. First thing, you cannot let the other side's imperative stand. That either means that you don't think the situation is all that bad, or that you have a different solution. And I know that technically, according to the rules of debating, op teams don't have to have their own solution, they can just negate the affirmative one. But in reality, you need an alternative solution if you're the opposition side. Because taking potshots and mudslinging at the affirmative model does nothing if you concede that there is a problem and you don't have a way of solving it yourself. And the debates and the adjudicators comparison sort of comes, the affirmative solution might work, the negative doesn't have a solution. Who do we prefer? So come up with a different solution and try to make it as different from the affirmative solution as possible. The best kinds of debates are usually a really heavy military solution versus a really heavy diplomatic solution. So if the affirmative is invading Iraq, the negative probably wants to try negotiating with ISIS or bribing them, or possibly, and like this is my own personal rogue approach, fund militias in the northern part of Iraq to fight against ISIS on your behalf. The second thing, and this is where like the obvious harms of an AF model are always picked up on, are the casualties of that intervention. And any idiot in a debate can sort of figure out, oh, they're going to invade, that means people are going to die. The way you make those arguments actually strong is by exaggerating how many people are going to die as much as possible. So go through the conflict and lay out like the worst case scenario. So US soldiers aren't going to be able to distinguish between ISIS and civilians. That means there's going to be a lot of casualties. The fighting is going to happen in the streets, which means that there's going to be a lot of collateral damage, etc., etc. The conflict is going to go on for a long time. So that's the first thing you do. You try and make it really clear that lots of people are going to die, much more than the athletes will. But that's not enough. You also need to explain why that's going to be more people die than in your alternative scenario. So if you agree that like the existing civil war in Iraq needs to be stopped, you need to try and create a picture in which the US invasion will kill more people than the existing civil war. Does anyone want to take a stab at that? Well, explain why an invasion in Iraq might kill more people than the existing war.
Like, I think it's handy to draw a trend of violence decreasing under the status quo. So maybe say that ISIS only wants to claim a certain portion of Iraq and will retreat afterwards. That's why there's not much of an imperative.
Yeah. That's certainly something you can tie back into that first point about why maybe an intervention isn't warranted is because this conflict is going to wear itself out in a few months anyway, and you might just add a whole nother layer of momentum to that conflict by bringing in a new invasion. Yeah, anyone else?
So a lot of the terrorist movements and militia movements are specifically driven by poorly run interventions, and by doing this you create an environment that is similar to the poor environment that led to the creation of ISIS in the first place. With the lack of structure implemented post-US intervention as a result thereof, that drove
I think that's the next category, long-term problems created by this. What we're mostly concentrating on now is like the immediate repercussion of this conflict and why we use it. Yeah.
Aren't terrorist organisations generally driven by the message that they can send about what like the West in general is doing to them? This will sort of give credence to what they're saying and could result in a bigger spike in terms of
I think that's a small part of a larger argument, which is that a US invasion makes the people living in northern Iraq more dependent on ISIS. So at the moment it's got like a very the negative team paints it as having like a very tenuous hold over the cities it controls. It has very small membership, and it mostly controls that area with like tenuous peace agreements with the warlords of that area. And if the US invade, suddenly all of those people become dependent on ISIS for protection from US armed forces. So it would certainly increase the recruitment of ISIS, but I think it would also increase the dependency on them for protection in that conflict. And you're sort of arguing that rather than ISIS continuously falling apart after a couple of months, you're now going to make them the official leaders of Iraq by making them the only actor who can resist the US invasion. Make sense? And that's the first layer of harms the net can attack, the harms of the invasion itself. The second sort of area to look at is the problems an invasion then creates for a long-term resolution of the conflict. And this is where you having your own long-term plan as something to compare is really important. So the way that you like think about this during prep time is, okay, the AF is going to solve this conflict by intervening and then forcing a partition plan. We need to do something instead that also accommodates that long-term problem. You might just want to run the partition plan argument without the invasion. And I think that would be a reasonable enough law. So we're going to try and negotiate with ISIS now rather than attacking them first. You might also want to try bribing specific actors within that country and then promising them seats in government after ISIS has been removed. Whatever floats your boat. And really any solution is as plausible as the next. We'll get into like the best ones later. But you need to try and, but the important thing to focus on in these debates is weighing the realistic potential that solution will work and the harms of the solution if they don't work. And the debate has to be a comparison between those, not just like a mudslinging contest of why the other sides won't work. And that's the difference between like an average debate and a really good one. Make sense? So, like the big question, what do I read? How do I know about things that help me with these debates? The like areas that you need to know about are the same for all conflicts, regardless of the country, regardless of what time period. I personally don't put that much weight into knowing the long and detailed history of a country before the conflict started. I think you really need to know the causes of the conflict. And that might be that there was like an ethnic division in that country, but how that division came about in the first place, probably not as important as what's happened in recent years that made that ethnic division the focus of a war. So in Iraq, the big thing I would try and learn about over the separation between like Sunni and Shia Muslims is not really the deep religious historical divide between those two. That's a little bit important, but not massively important. In Iraq specifically, it was that the Sunnis were promised seats in government and like proportion of minority representation, and the Shia government excluded them from all the ministries and gave them really marginal control over their own fate, right? And that's what's created the area that ISIS spread so effectively. The second thing to know about is all of the most important actors, so the people you'd be trying to kill or negotiate with if you try to intervene in this crisis. If you know virtually nothing about a conflict, like you've heard the name of the country or seen a 5-second news video on Facebook, I would recommend the BBC website as the first point of research. They break down major crises into like the important stakeholders, and they do very quick profiles of those stakeholders that tell you briefly about here's where this person got their power, here's why they're fighting, here's the people who support them and how strong. If you know a little bit, like when you know that amount of information, I would then go to the International Crisis Group. They usually talk about possible solutions to the conflict in a little bit more detail. And they talk about what each group would need to do to bring about each scenario. And you could probably go further into research than that. But after you know those things, the most important thing is to just like keep up to date with that crisis. So things like The Economist, things like the nightly news really, would be enough to sort of keep you abreast of what's going on. The thing you need from a debate perspective is how to argue in favour or against solutions to that problem. And I think you need to try and like at least briefly educate yourself on 2 possible solutions to each crisis. Because in general, a motion will force one team to have a particular solution, and the other side gets to pick whichever solution they're most willing to defend. So having one of those already prepared in your back pocket can save you a lot of time. And like in the case of Iraq, the main 2 solutions are probably a US invasion or attempting to let ISIS happen in some sort of partition solution. Those are like the main areas I would recommend that you research if you're really serious about these. And just a list of some of the like main conflicts happening at the moment that are likely to be topics in the near future. Yeah.
You say the resource off the BBC website.
Sorry?
What did you say off the BBC website?
International Crisis Group. If you Google that, you should find their website. It has like a list of countries, then the issues in those countries, and reports detailing possible solutions. And it's just like, it sort of tells you what each actor would have to do. Any questions about like research, what types of things you do? No? Cool. I think that's it, yeah. That's all I had prepared. We've got what, 10 minutes? Does anyone like have anything they'd like me to talk about in more detail that they didn't particularly understand? Yeah.
You can probably talk a little bit about what you envision a soft approach to Iraq would look like.
Envision
a soft like
a soft
negotiate
approach
with ISIS.
Okay. So the side with the alternative to a military intervention. Alright. So like you should have a reasonably easy time arguing against the military intervention, see how it will create all kinds of strife, etc., etc. Your substantive case then needs to present something for ISIS to want to engage with. So I think you need to be willing to offer them either complete control of that northern part of Iraq or like highly representative control. And when you're arguing for these things, it's usually useful to break down that act into its constituent parts. So ISIS, collectively meaning Sunni Iraq, consists of some radical religious extremists who want to destroy everything the Western nation form a caliphate. But most of the people living in that region are like on board with ISIS just because it's the best option they have available to them at the moment. So if you're willing to offer a solution to that part